Welcome to panel 6 for the International Space Medicine Summit. Just a brief reminder that this is the last panel for today, but there will be 2 very good panels on Monday, and I encourage everyone to attend those. This particular panel is on the Apollo program, and Bill Shepard is the moderator. Bill has been a long time friend of the International Space Medicine Summit and has been a leader and participant for many years. He attended the Naval Academy, where he got a BS in the aerospace engineering, and then went to MIT and got advanced degrees in ocean engineering and also mechanical engineering. He was a SEAL, and he first of all started in underwater work with the Navy, then became a SEAL, and was selected in the astronaut class of 1984. During his time at NASA, he was the flew on 3 different shuttle missions, STS 27, 41, and 52. I was lucky enough to be for my first mission in mission control for STS 27, and got to hear a lot of interesting things on the during the countdown from Bill and Hooten, the other folks on the mission. After he was ISS program manager, it was that type of work that led him to be picked as the Expedition 1 commander, and that flight kind of moved west over time, and spent a lot of time working on Expedition 1, which turned out to be a very successful mission. And hopefully Sergey will be on, who was one of the other crew members on that mission. He retired from NASA in 2001 and the Navy around 2002. He stayed very busy. He's had more trophies and awards and prestigious honors than you could shake a stick at. I know he's done a lot of work with institutions like the Stevens Institute in New Jersey and other things since then, but we'll skip that and turn it over to Bill.
Well, thank you, Richard. It's a great panel, and I'd like to lead off with General Tom Stafford, who graduated from the Naval Academy in 1952 and served. I guess he saw the light and went into the Air Force and became a fighter pilot and test pilot. And in '62, he was selected to train as a NASA astronaut in Group 2. He flew Gemini 6A and Gemini 9A missions and commanded the Apollo 10 mission to the moon, where the lunar module flew within 9 miles of the lunar surface. General Stafford then went on to command the first U.S.-Russian space mission, the Apollo-Soyuz flight in 1975. He left NASA to command the Air Force Test Center and then retired from the Air Force in 1979. Since then, he's been an aerospace and defense consultant and has served on numerous industry boards. However, NASA called him back in the early 1990 period, and he chaired a landmark study on the long-term Moon and Mars explorations, and was then the co-lead on what was called the Stafford-Utkin Advisory Commission, which set the foundation for our present collaboration with the Russian Space Agency. He continues to lead NASA's ISS Advisory Committee along with Russian Space Agency's Sergei Krikalev. And he's got a list of awards and accolades that are probably too long for the rest of the hour we've got. But I'd like to turn it over to General Tom, and maybe he can talk about the important things that set up the Apollo program and the missions to the moon to be a success. What was essential to all that? Tom, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Shep. Good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here for this discussion session. As Shep pointed out, I came on board about 2 months after it was decided to go to the moon using a lunar orbit rendezvous for the architecture. And so we're now looking forward to the Artemis. And what type of architecture do we have? I'll get a little bit into that. But I think we have to review what the great American writer George Santiago said. Those that ignore the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them. And it couldn't be more so than what we have right now. Okay. President Kennedy made the commitment on 25 May 1961, we'll go to the moon, so that was the target. We had the goal. The main question was how? How do we go to this? And that was a big one. Several controversies. Dr. Gilruth there wanted to have one giant booster, probably weigh about 14 or 15 million pounds, drop off stages, go direct, drop land. It'd probably be a huge thing on the moon and coming back. Ron Braun had a different idea, having 2, maybe 10 million pound vehicles that rendezvous in low Earth orbit and then go. And Dr. John Hugel from Langley came up with the idea of and that took a little while. It was decided, I pointed out, in July 1962, and then my group came on board. But at the same time, they said, okay, we're going to go to the moon. What do we have to bridge the gap from Mercury to Apollo? So that's where the Gemini program was put in. And what we had available for launching the low Earth orbit, the biggest thing we had was the Titan II ballistic missile that would put about 8,000 pounds into 160 nautical mile circular orbit. So that was how Gemini got started off. Just really a memorandum of understanding to the a one-page piece of paper about having 2 people on board the Titan II and have a computer, radar, be able to perform rendezvous, also be able to go up to 2 weeks in duration. You have navigation space and also would have retrofire a guided re-entry to a precise landing point. All this is required, as we can see from the lunar mission. Now, the one thing, everything was put under NASA. The Air Force wanted some things. That was our real strength. Everything was under NASA. And NASA was the advocate. Even though we had the DOD supporting it, we had lots of other entities in the federal government supporting it. We were very blessed. We had probably one of the greatest program managers of all time. General Sam Phillips came in as the program manager. He had a tremendous background through fighters in World War II. And then he was program manager for the B-52. Part of the telephone was ringing in the background. It's important calls spammers. And anyway, he then went on after managing the B-52 to put the 1,000 Minuteman missiles in the silos. So it was a tremendous undertaking. And Sam did a great job. There's one theory that he continued. Pardon. Oh, disconnect the phone. Was keep it simple, keep the simplicity. In fact, Dr. Von Braun often echoed that. Keep it simple. This is one thing looking forward to the future that I see with the Artemis program. We're talking about 8 to 12 launches to do one landing. Way too complicated. We may have had a low probability of success in missions, but Gemini carried those out. It was a very fast moving program. We had, once we started flying Gemini 3, first mission there. That was Gus Gusson, John Young. I was the backup pilot for John. Well, I should all back to Gus. But we had 10 missions in 20 months. And we carried out everything that we needed to. Had 2 close calls. First one was with Sharon and myself. When we entered the launch on July 6th, the boosters let off and then shut out exactly T0 with the liftoff signal. We had an automatic system with ejectors. It probably looked like 2 Roman candles since we've been soaking in pure oxygen for 2 hours. all manual. We never had much law. So, and those people say, oh, automatic systems are manual. There's got to be a good trade-off. But you have to have some experienced people and people with common sense to design any of these systems. The long duration, oh, the other one, Neil Armstrong, Dave Scott, and Jennings, after the dock with Regina Lott. At that time, one of the thrusters on Jennings shorted and started flying an old thruster. And they got spinning up to 1 revolution per second. They were really starting to red out. And that, Neil finally got it under control. We've gone through 2 rings of the entry thrusters. We've gone through fuel of 1 ring down to half a ring. We finally got them stabilized. A good electrical re-entry. We also had extra activity. And that was Gemini 9. Sun was the first one to do a complete walk around the Earth. In 2 hours, we lost 13 pounds. We didn't have a liquid cool garment. We didn't even think about putting default on the life. We had a few tough calls there in Germany. Germany paved all the way for Apollo. And for all those losses, really both Germany and Apollo, I can tell you that without Germany, Apollo would have been unmitigated. But we did have a setback in Germany on the Apollo with the tragic fire there in January 1964. And that set us back for around 18 months. However, once we regrouped, got things re-engineered, we started flying in October of '68. Then, in just 9 months, we did 5 missions in 9 months. And 4 of those were on the giant Saturn V. 3 of those were to the moon. 3 of them had 2 spacecraft on it. 1 Earth orbit, Apollo 9, and then I flew the first deal of spacecraft configuration, the movie command. So it was a real fast-paced thing, but it was well thought out. We had a strong program on it. We had very experienced, great leaders. And if you don't have that, it's going to be a real difficult test. Anybody have any questions?
Hey, Tom, it's Shep. I got that you're keen on the architecture, having strong leadership, experienced people, and keeping it simple. I'd like to double back if we can get Sergey on the line later and talk a little bit about the early cooperation with the Russians. But I want to shift gears and give the mic to Jerry Griffin and ask Jerry Griffin to talk a little bit about the ground picture in mission control and the art of flight control. Jerry was a former director at the Johnson Space Center, and he earned a Bachelor of Science from Texas A&M and was commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Air Force. He joined NASA in '64 as a flight controller for mission control and was then selected to be a flight director for all the Apollo manned missions. And Jerry was the lead flight director for Apollo 12, 15, and 17. And his team, the Gold Team, conducted the lunar landings on 14, 16, and 17, and also played a key role in bringing back safely the astronauts who were on Apollo 13. He subsequently served as a deputy director of the JFK Center in Florida and the Neil Armstrong Flight Research Center in California. I guess that was Dryden back in the day. He also has several important jobs at NASA headquarters, including Deputy Associate Administrator for Spaceflight Operations. Today, Jerry is a technical and management consultant for a broad range of clients and a member of the advisory board of Texas A&M's Engineering Experiment Station. So, Jerry, over to you if you can tell us what mission control looked like.
Well, thanks, Shep. It was a very interesting time because in the Mercury days, what Chris Kraft, our mentor, had done was pattern mission control after their flight test experience, clear up through the X-15. And, but of course it had some differences because it had ground stations all around the world and so forth and so on, which we eventually got rid of with satellite technology. But there were a lot of moving parts. And it was interesting that most of us came from an aviation background in the early days. Now, that wasn't totally true because in mission control, we actually had kids right out of college. I mean, 21-year-old, 22-year-old. When I got to the control center, I was 29 because I served 4 years on active duty with the Air Force. And so I was one of the oldest guys in the room. And we had a bunch of kids that were figuring it out. From the standpoint of program management and all of that, they were probably, I think, in all of my years with NASA, they were the most fun. Let me call it fun for want of another word. In those days, decisions were pushed down. Program management and all wanted the people that were sitting at the breach to make the decisions. And they trusted us. They trusted the young guys to get it done. We trusted our management and our leadership above them because there was a trust that we had for them too. And interesting, I can remember in the early going, I think we all wanted to do well so that we could please people like George Lowe, Bob Gilruth, and Chris Kraft. We wanted to please them. And so mission control became a very can-do. It very rapidly became very much a can-do thing. I can remember back to Apollo 13 and talking with Ron Howard before he made the movie. He was trying to make a decision on whether to make a movie or not. And he said, "Were you scared?" And an interesting question, because the answer, there were about half a dozen of us, including Lovell and Kraft. And we said, no, scared is not the right word. We were trained to do what we were doing, and that is to get the crew home. And so it was a fun time. I'm often asked, what was your favorite job in NASA? It had to be the director of the JFC. And yeah, that was different. That was a lot of politics and a lot of budget and a lot of other center involvement and all that. But I have to say the best job I ever had was being a flight director in mission control. When I was made a flight director, I was 33. And Glenn Lunny, who was named right before me, was even younger. So we had this tremendous, there are only 6 of us that had teams for Apollo. And when I think about how much responsibility we had that program management had just given to us, and the flight director had that last decision, he had a lot of help, but tremendous responsibility. And I think everyone in mission control felt that responsibility. So we had, I would call it the best years of maybe in mission control, and I think we'll get in the Apollo era. I think it's been great handled on the shuttle and the ISS, different kind of job, very in low Earth orbit, lots of grinding, and we had lots of dynamic short periods, and then it slowed down even more. But I think Artemis is going to be another test. And let me tell you what, I'm going to maybe jump ahead of you here a little bit, Shep, but let me tell you what I think the biggest lesson that Artemis can take away from Apollo. And it's not there's plenty of technical stuff, but the technology is so much better today. I really do believe the fact that we just did it took a big barrier out of the way. When we were doing Apollo, it had never been done. And we thought we could do it, but it never had been proven. Just an awful lot of energy and moving parts to hold together and make them work, integrate them properly. But we did it. And so we know it can be done. You can create the hardware and the software and the people and the training, et cetera, et cetera. And that step is out of the way for Artemis, which I think is one of the biggest things they have to bring out of Apollo.
Jerry, great stuff. We'll circle back to you with some questions. But Fred Hayes is a panel member. He could not be with us today, but he did record a video, which I'll play for you in just a second. But I'll do a quick introduction for Fred. He graduated from the University of Oklahoma, and he flew with the Marine Corps, and then the Air Force, and then NASA as a test pilot. In '66, he was selected in astronaut group 5 and was a backup lunar module pilot for both Apollo 8 and the Apollo 11 missions. He was then assigned at the last minute as lunar module pilot on Apollo 13, and he was to have been the 6th person to walk on the moon, but the mission was aborted en route. Everybody knows the story, but the efforts of the ground control teams, Jerry and his gold team, and the crew on board to make their return safely back to Earth can only be described as heroic. Fred went on to fly 5 space shuttle approach flights in 1977 before the first shuttle went into space, and retired from NASA in 1979. So if we could roll Fred's video, please, I think you'll find this very interesting.
Most of the media attention during Apollo was given to us, to the astronauts and the mission control, centered on the missions. But the real success, and particularly in meeting a schedule, real schedule pressure, was beyond us astronauts. Certainly with our families, who was a real challenge for them to do without us so much. I trained for 4 missions back to back. Apollo 8, 11, 13, and 16. And during much of that time, I was not home because everything we did in training was somewhere else. My simulators were, training simulators were down at Kennedy Space Center. Geology field training was all over the country, and in fact, sometimes a few out of the country. And of course, testing the vehicles we're going to fly involved being at Kennedy or at the plants, the factories where they were built. So clearly our families had to do without a father much of the time as part of a sacrifice made. Beyond that, of course, there was all the workers across the program. It was a large program. Over 400,000 people worked on it at peak. And back at the home plants and through their subcontractors, the same thing, lots of hours. I spent most of 1967 at the Grumman Corporation testing lunar modules. During that year of 1967, the test operations I was involved with went 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and only planned to shut down and only shut down 1 day of the year, Christmas Day. Of course, this went beyond those prime contractors at Grumman and North American on the other coast with the command and service module to their subcontractors, the great pressure to meet schedules and make deliverables to get the vehicles ready to go to the Cape. So it's really that sacrifice by so many that made the Apollo program successful. And I just feel blessed to have been a part of that program.
Great words from Fred, and I think we can double back with the panel on some questions about stress and family life after. But I want to introduce Dr. Bonnie Dunbar. She received a Bachelor of Science and Master of Science degrees in ceramic engineering from the University of Washington, and then a doctorate in mechanical and biomedical engineering from the University of Houston. In 1980, Dr. Dunbar was selected in astronaut group 9 and she flew in 1985 as a mission specialist on 61A and STS-32 in 1990. She was the payload commander on STS-50 in 1992, and then in 94, she was part of the first two astronauts who trained in Star City, Russia for 13 months, and she was a backup crew member for Norm Thagard's flight to the Mir shortly thereafter. She flew then as a mission specialist, number 3 on STS-71 in 1995, which was the first shuttle mission to dock with the Mir. In 98, she was the payload commander aboard STS-89, which was her sixth shuttle flight. The sixth shuttle flight to Mir. On Bonnie's 5 missions, she has logged more than 50 days in space. Bonnie has also served as the Deputy Associate Administrator of NASA headquarters and in 2 associate director roles at the Johnson Space Center. Bonnie is currently a professor of aerospace engineering at Texas A&M and directs their Aerospace Human Systems Laboratory. Bonnie, over to you. You want to talk about your shuttle experience and then something maybe about the science that came out of the Apollo era?
Okay, thank you very much, Shep. I'm going to back up just a bit to talk about how I overlapped with Apollo. Actually, I became very interested in space as a young girl, reading science fiction. But I was one of those young kids who went out with my parents to look for Sputnik in 1957. And that helped to shape my career towards engineering. And actually watched Apollo 11 and Neil Armstrong walking on the moon between my sophomore and junior years at the University of Washington. It was at the University of Washington, though, that I became involved in the space shuttle program, particularly in doing some of the basic research on the thermal protection systems. And that then led to a job at Rockwell International Space Division. Now, I showed up there in 1976. So I was working side by side with engineers, managers, and machinists who'd really been part of the Apollo program. They built the second stage of the Saturn V and the command and service module. So I was exposed to a culture largely formed part of Apollo, but also after the Apollo 1 fire. And that was a culture of communications, strong program management, systems integration and testing, thoroughly understanding failures during testing before progressing to the next steps, integration of the crew along all aspects of development, and a strong culture of safety. And in fact, the Silver Snoopy Award was established during Apollo as a mechanism of recognizing outstanding performance among employees of NASA and its contractors contributing to flight safety and mission success. And when I became an astronaut, it was always a thrill to me to put on my blue suit and go back into the machine shops or in the administrative offices and give a silver Snoopy. At the present time, I am a professor in aerospace engineering at Texas A&M and director of the Aerospace Human Systems Laboratory. Now, I established that laboratory in 2016 and modeled it in some respects from the MIT Manned Systems Laboratory, which was established during Apollo. We're engaged in advanced technology for spacesuit systems development, space habitats, systems engineering, and human systems integration, bioastronautics, and we do quite a bit of research related to life support, such as two-phase fluid physics and partial gravity environments. I try to bring these processes and culture and the history of aviation and space to all my students, because I believe that the lessons learned and the attributes that made these successful are important to continue to educate. I learned from them. I saw them in Space Shuttle. I think they're important for the future, because when these cultures falter, we lose vehicles and crew. I'm hoping that I'm contributing to the pipeline of engineers. This is important. And at Texas A&M, our advisory board in aerospace engineering recommended that we establish a curricula and a focus on systems engineering. So I was put in charge of this faculty group. We call ourselves the Systems Design and Human Integration Group. Our graduate students are already being placed as systems engineers and safety project engineers and with the human spaceflight aerospace contractors. And a couple of my PhD students are actually going into research related to human spaceflight. We continue to be challenged on that pipeline. I think that's an important focus for both industry and NASA in terms of the future and for our international partners as well. We need that workforce, but we also need to make sure that we understand the lessons learned of the past and build that culture in today's students. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Bonnie, great stuff. And you kind of underscored the reason why I asked our next speaker, Johnny Kim, to join the panel. Johnny is a lieutenant commander and he's still a serving Navy SEAL. And he, as an enlisted troop, he completed 100 combat missions in his SEAL tours and was awarded the Silver Star and the Bronze Star with a Combat V. He then was in the Navy's enlisted to officer program, and he earned a mathematics degree at the University of San Diego, and then a doctor of medicine from the Harvard Medical School. And in 2017, Johnny was selected for the new astronaut candidate class. He reported for duty in August that year and served as the International Space Station's increment lead for Expedition 65 in 2021. And I know Johnny is very motivated by things that he saw as a young person in the space program. And so that's why I think we all would be very interested to hear what Johnny's background was and how the hell he got to NASA. Over to you, Johnny. Yeah, Johnny, we're not reading you for some reason here.
How about now?
We're good. We're good.
My mistake. Hey, Shep, thank you for the introduction. My name is Lieutenant Commander Johnny Kim. I was selected to NASA in 2017 and joined the Navy about 20 years ago. And the reason why I am an astronaut, well, really, a lot of the reason is because of the people on this panel here. A lot of my heroes growing up, Jerry Griffin, Bonnie Dunbar, General Staff Fred Hayes. You know, I grew up, and when I grew up, I was born in 1984. And so when I grew up, we all had pictures of astronauts on our walls. And the allure of NASA and that mission for space exploration for the betterment of humankind it resonates with everyone, regardless of where you live or who you are or what your race, creed, citizenship is. And it certainly did for me. And I, like a lot of people, wanted my life to matter a lot. And it's one of the reasons why I joined the Navy, to become a SEAL. I've wanted to be an astronaut, but I never thought that I could actually be one until I had really amazing challenges and formative experiences from the post 9/11 wars that I said, hey, you know what? I'd like for my life to have meaning, to have a purpose-driven life. And I wanted to dedicate my life to combat military fashion. And so I was motivated to pursue medicine. I got my medical degree and was working on my way to become an emergency physician when the call for NASA astronauts came out. And this was also around the time that I met the first astronaut I've ever met was Scott Perenzinski, who was also a medical physician and contributed to many shuttle missions. And it was the planting of that seed where I realized NASA as an organization and the astronauts and the directors and the technicians and the engineers, they make life better for everyone through public service because they explore not just for themselves, but for humanity, to bring that back and make the world a better place. And so that resonated with me on many levels as far as making my life worthwhile, serving others, and making the world a better place. And that's why I'm here today. I'm calling you all from NASA Johnson Space Center, from one of the conference rooms here, and very, very privileged to be a part of this panel. Over to you, Shep.
Okay, great, Johnny. I want to go back to General Stafford for just a second. And General, can you talk a little bit about the importance of your work with the Russians, both on the Apollo-Soyuz project and also after that with the academician Utkin and then the things you're doing now with Sergei Krikalev on the space station panel?
Certainly. Well, you know, they had two different approaches as far as operations, and we had to work those out. And you know, there was a common goal to be successful, but different approaches. So oftentimes NASA and Los Cosmos would have a different approach. So they would fill it up to the two groups, and we would get the issue all settled, worked on. So, you know, we spent a lot of time in the Russian Federation and started to say Soviet Union, which that was daily. And so we spent a lot of time there, and they spent a lot of time over here. So it worked out real well. But those in the group still does a lot of positive work. Oftentimes you have parochial views, rights, everything, but it works out real well by having this. And,
Thank you, Tom. I'd like to just point out something I learned recently I was not aware of, that they're floating around NASA somewhere. There's a 70+ page document of the things that we've learned by working with the Russians. Bonnie, maybe your lab has a way to track that down, but maybe you saw that in the shuttle Mir program, but I've never seen that document. I think it would be an important piece of paper to take a look at. Over to you, Bonnie. Any thoughts?
I haven't seen the document. It's something I can certainly sick my graduate students on. But if it's inside a NASA repository, it might be a little bit hard, but sometimes some of those NSTRS documents are released. So I'll take a note. We'll try to look for it.
It was something that the White House, I guess the Science and Technology panel asked for, or maybe it was, I think the White House asked for it. NASA headquarters generated it, but nobody's ever read it. So just one of those things. I'd like to ask Jerry, what were the big surprises in the moon missions for you and mission control? Jerry, I think you're muted.
Be quiet. That's an interesting question because, you know, we built up to the lunar missions very slowly, and we didn't have any huge, well, you could call the fire a big surprise, but that was something else. We didn't have any huge surprises. One thing that did, and I've stressed this with the current people at JSC, that I remember on Apollo 8, and I bet Tom does too, when we did TLI, there was kind of a gulp moment. Now we've done it. Now we're sending them off out of our sphere of influence to another place. And I think that surprise was not the right word, but the realization that we weren't going to be able to get them home real fast. You're out at the moon, that's 3.5 days to get home. It's different than low Earth orbit. It's a different feel. And I think once we got to the moon, the only surprises that we had were, and it was more the crew, I didn't think the dust and dirt would be as bad as it was. The regolith came off the moon like flour, and it was embedded into their suits. Two of the rovers, 16 and 17, lost fenders that protected the dust from flying up high, and eventually on both of those missions, they drove the rover without that fender, and it just threw the dust completely over on top of them and dusted them up really nice. It's very hard to get the stuff off of them, which tells me, and I know they're working on new technologies, electrostatic and so forth, to try to help that, but I really think that could be a problem for a long-term stay on the moon. And that was, to me, I just hadn't thought of it. It was a surprise. And then I guess the only other thing was kind of the nice part of the mission. The big surprise was seeing those guys step out on the carrier, particularly on Apollo 8, and we knew we could do it. So I think, again, the program was put together well. It built one on top of the other. I put Mercury and Gemini as part of Apollo. That was really all the same task. We were trying to figure out how to do it. And Gemini was so vital. I'll tell you a surprise that I had. We had, until we rendezvoused with another spacecraft on Tom's mission, I had never thought of rendezvous being very easy. We were all scared to death of it. That, you got to go find that little piece of other hardware up there and dock up with it. Well, it turned out it was not a big as deal as we thought. We've never missed one. And so that was kind of a surprise that I guess was a good surprise. And it's held throughout now. Now we do it routinely, automatically. So, yeah, we had some surprises, but most of them were small in nature.
Great stuff, Jerry. Okay, I'd like to go around the horn to the rest of the panel because we're coming up on the end of the clock here, and I want to give time for a question or two from the audience. But can the rest of the panel summarize what you think are the takeaways from your experiences or knowledge of the Apollo program? Some of the big lessons learned that might apply to Artemis. And Bonnie, let me start with you.
Okay, I think I touched on it a little bit. I think one of the strengths of the Apollo program, when you read the history, the lessons learned, and you talk to those who were there, such as Jerry and Tom, is first of all, you had a strong program management, someone who had the big picture. You had a systems engineering mentality where you knew how everything fit together. And that is so critical when you have failures. You have to know root cause before you go on. The incremental steps, as Jerry pointed out, really started back in Mercury and Gemini, and then into Apollo, 1-person, 2-person, life support systems, going to orbit, staying in orbit, doing rendezvous and docking, all of those pieces that fit together before we went to the moon that we had some level of confidence in. So I think that's critically important. Jerry talked on one short thing there about youth. I love working with these young engineers. I love talking to them about how everything fits together and teaching them history they haven't had yet. And I recall that when I was at Rockwell and was put in charge of setting up the processes for the tile production facility out at Palmdale, I kept saying, but I'm only 29. I'm not old enough to do this. But it was a great experience.
Johnny, over to you. Do you think you, as a class, do you get enough insight into some of the legacy of Apollo and information about what went on to get you guys up to speed about the new challenges you're facing?
I think we recognize as an astronaut corps, we recognize how important the lessons learned of Apollo and shuttle are. Sometimes, there is really vital institutional knowledge that's not documented, that is lost through the sands of time. And we have had Apollo astronauts. Jerry Griffin, I remember you coming back to talk to us as an office. And I think that's really important when we invite astronauts and flight directors who have been there during that time to come back and share so many of those important lessons learned and review the literature and the after action reports on that. I think everyone on this panel can comment much better than I on their own experiences and what they think will be valuable bringing forward to Artemis as we return to the moon. I would say from my perspective, what I hear, and just from my own military experiences, is bringing strong organizational culture and trust is going to be very, very, very important as we move forward, because as people have noted on this panel, it wasn't just the astronauts, it was the technicians, the engineers, the directors, NASA as an organization working together as a team to get Apollo astronauts on the moon. And it's going to be the same as we get back to the moon for Artemis.
Yeah, great stuff. I want to ask Jerry one question before I finish up with General Stafford. Jerry, do you think it's going to be hard to replicate the energy and the competence in mission control going forward, similar to what you had in the heyday of the space race?
Well, I hope not, and I don't think so. I think they will be extremely energetic. I give them a lot for hanging on with ISS and even the shuttle before that, of grinding it out in low Earth orbit. That's not easy either. But there is an excitement that just when you start to leave this planet, and there's an excitement that's built in that kicks in that I think is going to be significant. One of the things that I think Artemis, and it is, by the way, it's time to pass that torch. It's great to talk about Apollo, and I'm glad I'm still around to do it. And it's great to celebrate those anniversaries and all that. But the torch is about, we got to pass it now to Artemis. And we got to put that focus on. One of the things I'm a little concerned about that we learned in Apollo, and that is, let me call it for a better word, integration of all the pieces. We've got an awful lot of moving parts in Artemis with Gateway and landers that are coming along kind of slowly, and Orion, and then the SLS itself, which has many parts. You know, in Apollo, it was still a huge task, but we finally pulled Kraft and others pulled Bill Tyndall out in something we call data priority. The name was a misnomer. I never did like it. But what Bill did was led an effort where he had all the liars come in once a week, all the people from these different pieces and parts, and they would talk through, how are we going to do this segment of the mission? And they would talk through, and out of that came the techniques that we would actually approach the moon with. I hope the Artemis piece has the same integration mentality. That's the hardest part. It's when you bring those pieces together and make sure they work together and play together. And Bonnie mentioned the systems engineering and all the has to go into that. But I think the mission control people for Artemis are going to be happy. They're going to be excited. They're going to be busy as heck. And I wish them all the best in luck.
Great stuff. General, I'll give you the last word. Any final thoughts on moving forward, going back to the moon?
Sure, Shep. And as you know, I'm not bashful in bringing things up. You know, in congressional testimony that Tom Young used to be the director of Goddard Space Flight Center and later president of Martin Marietta, Merger Lockheed, he retired. He still does a lot of effort for NASA volunteer work, just like that. We had, Tom Young and I had a joint testimony for the House Science, Space, and Tech Committee there in November 2019. And from that, I used that again from Doug Cook, who a lot of you know, who testified earlier. And looking, this thing is so complicated that I said the mission success for Artemis is going to be between 49 and 51%. That's all you've got. You've made it way, way too complicated. So, you know, we had a number of 3 nines as far as from ignition to going into orbit as far as crew survival, 3 nines. After that, it was kind of loose. We did not have a number put together for survivability of the crew or for mission success. on the lunar missions. Everybody was kind of guessing that. We came back and retro looked at the critical operations. Cook did this primarily. When we look at it, Apollo should have been about 80% if we looked at it. Turned out Apollo was 87.5%. The only mission that was not completed unsuccessful was Apollo 13. But we got the crew back. So right now I'm saying with this gateway, all the using 8 or 9 launches to do one landing, going through the gateway, coming back. We got a mission success yet, probably 50% at the list. And I think the Congress is going to chew the heck out of it. And start right there in congressional testimony. Doug Cook, myself, several others. We made it way too complicated.
Well, I gotta commend Baker Institute for having the cojones to have a forum like this, because these are opinions you're not going to hear voiced too often inside the Beltway. I think these are very serious comments, and they need to be aired out way more broadly than is being done now. Over to Richard. Do we have any time left? Any questions we can answer from the crowd? Hello, Richard.
I'm here. Just had it muted.
A, do we have any time left? And B, are there questions from the audience?
Yeah, you've got another 10 minutes. Looking at the questions, I don't see any further questions that have been submitted.
Okay. Well, anybody want to voice something that they want to get off their chest before we sign this off?
Yeah, let me talk to Richard. Well, to America at the threshold. I was the chairman. George Abbey was my vice chairman. One thing really came through loud and clear. You look at the whole thing is the atmospheric pressure of the spacecraft. Remember on Apollo, we had 5 psi pure O2. And the problem was we had to start with that. After the fire, we changed it. 60-40 and then blood down and then 5 after we got to orbit for a bit of time. But Skylab had 3.5 O2, 1.5 N2. So then when you want to go for an EVA period of time, you just put on your helmet and gloves and go. And having that 2 hours of pre-breathing is wasted time. And then when you talk about particularly Mars, and carrying that amount of mass all the way out there. And if you have a leak, you're in much better shape. Just look at Boyle's law. If you have 5 psi, I think Skylab was probably the optimal. 3.5 O2, 1.5 N2. You're not going to get to bed. And your makeup is far less than if you have 14.7 psi. We now have electronics where you don't need all that air for cooling. Over to you, Richard.
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm not sure yet that they've decided on the absolute environment for the Mars surface. As you know, they're going to have to be doing EVAs all the time, and you're exactly right that they can't pre-breathe every time, 2 to 4 hours like we do for the EMU and the shuttle. That can't happen. Oxygen's a very interesting thing because too little you have problems, but you also have problems if you have too much. For example, we always worried in the shuttle if we had more than, say, 6 hours of 100% oxygen at 14.7, and which is one of the reasons you had 5 for the Apollo capsule. And we didn't know anything about 60-40 for Skylab. And we spent, as you know, Bo Bobko and Crippen and Bill Thornton spent a lot of time in the SMET trying to learn and figure that out. And I think they're still working on the ideal atmosphere that avoids fire hazard in case there's a leak, consumables. With the rocket equation, they're very interested in keeping mass low, as you know, for going to Mars. I think for the vehicles that fly there without humans, you can go longer and you can carry heavier mass. But with humans, you have to keep the mass low so you can get them there in a reasonable amount of time, as long as you're using chemical propulsion. If you use other propulsion, you might could do a little better, but I'm not sure they've set. I keep hearing 8 psi, give or take, for the total pressure to try to reduce the need for EVAs, because there's going to be multiple EVAs on the moon and in Mars.
I'd like to weigh in with one comment, and maybe Richard and Bonnie can double down on it. I've always thought that the Russian approach to some of their crew equipment, and particularly their EMU suits, the so-called, was actually quite good. Some aspects of our space shuttle and space station suits on the U.S. side were better, particularly the gloves and some of the articulation in the arm joints. But from an engineering standpoint, there's a lot of goodness in the Russian so-called suit and their ability to jam the pressure up when they need to. I'm just saying that these approaches are things that should be looked at carefully for moon suits and stuff we need for Mars. But every time I see something that says we're going to do a new EVA suit for the moon, it's bigger, it's heavier, and it's more complex. And I think from an engineering standpoint, we're moving absolutely in the wrong direction. Over to the panel for comments.
Well, Shep, I can talk about that because we're looking at that type of thing in the lab. As you may recall, and Tom can attest to this, every Apollo crew member, actually Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, had a customized suit. In fact, in Apollo, they had 3 suits, prime, backup, and training. They're pretty lightweight, and those were EVA suits. You and I both had Sokol suits, which were IVA. They weren't meant to do surface walks, but they were also customized. And having had that experience of a customized suit versus the standard sizes in the shuttle, I can attest to the fact that I'd much rather work in a customized suit that didn't feel like my father's overalls and made mobility much easier than to try to sandwich everybody into a standard set of sizes. Part of the argument against that has always been either logistics, supplies, cost, or schedule, but we're actually addressing all of those because you won't find a lot of data supporting that. And I have a NIAC grant from NASA right now looking at that, is how can we apply modern manufacturing technologies, the digital thread, to try to customize suits, particularly for Mars, and also look at logistics as well as maintenance. So there's room for improvement. We are where we are right now, but we're hoping as we move forward and we have more long duration missions on the moon and we're moving on to Mars, that we can apply many of the new technologies and approaches to protection for humans into new spacesuits.
Just for Johnny's edification, when I got to NASA and I got introduced to the shuttle suit, the EMU, not only do you have a computer controlling everything, but you have 5 stages of regulator between your emergency oxygen supply and you. And that's something you would never see in a piece of diving gear anywhere. And the Russian suit, it does have a manual emergency bypass. If you don't have cooling, if you don't have pressure, if you don't have enough oxygen, you flip one lever and you got it. And that's a whole different design philosophy. And I think being a SEAL, Johnny, you're going to like Russian hardware a lot better than some of the stuff you're going to see in Houston. For you,
Bill, this isn't my area. That's never stopped me from speaking before. And I do think that they're going to be, serviceability is going to be a huge issue. The EMU is not that serviceable. It's very complex. The Orlan suit has, I think, one real advantage over the EMU, and that you can get in it by yourself. The ability to doff and don, it's nice to have help, but pretty much not possible, not very possible with the EMU. It's a 2-person job. And I do agree with you that if we could, simplicity and durability, when they're going to be gone for so long and we can't resupply them, is going to be very important.
Johnny, what's important in your mind for a suit?
Well, I'll caveat that, I haven't actually done a real spacewalk. I've done plenty of runs in the neutral buoyancy lab. But as a rookie, what I've seen, what I'm hearing, are some of the things that you all are talking about. A suit that's durable, a suit preferably that's simplistic. Shep, as you were talking about military hardware, and we're talking about breathing at 100%. Both you and I were SEALs, and so we spent quite a bit of time diving underwater with open circuit regulators, closed circuit regulators, Draegers. So a lot of that stuff is pretty similar, especially once you add in the medical component, Dr. Jennings, when it comes to oxygen toxicity, or of course the DCS risks once we start talking about atmospheres and the pre-breathing required to do an EVA. But I think there's really nothing new. I think something that's durable, easily fixable, simplistic. And as Bonnie mentioned, we need a suit that adapts and fits the majority of our astronauts. And astronauts come in different shapes and sizes. And so we're going to need one that fits, because it is, with the current EMU suits, if not being anthropometrically fitted well to it can make a spacewalk very difficult, as I think most people on this panel know. So I think those would be my comments with respect to suits moving forward.
Yeah, as Jerry brought up, I think the attraction of the moon dust is a problem that's going to bug us for quite some time.
Bill, in 1977, NASA tried to broaden the astronaut classes, and they kind of went to a 5th percentile Asian female size-wise up to a 95th percentile Caucasian male. They neglected to make spacesuits, EMUs, that would fit the smaller people. And if they're going to continue their pursuit of diversity, we're going to have suits that fit small people and large people adequately. The other thing is that in flight medicine, we've just seen an awful lot of shoulders that had to have surgery from the EMU. We've got to make a suit that doesn't hurt people. It's got to do all the things to protect them from temperature, and radiation and light and bends and oxygen toxicity, all those things it's got to do. But we've got to make one that doesn't hurt people also.
I think
Go ahead.
I think we underestimate the complexity of a suit. It's really a human-shaped spacesuit that has to provide mobility, not cause injury, has to be robust as we move away from the Earth, has to have, as you mentioned before, some durability and maybe some ability to have some redundant systems that don't build into complexity, because you're not going to have the ability to have a support system on Earth, or maybe even be close enough to a habitat. So all of those things go back into the requirements of the future suit.
Okay, Richard, I think we're
All right.
done.
Well, thank everyone for participating today. It was a great panel. Appreciate all the ones who attended it. We'll see you on Monday.
Good luck, Johnny.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Johnny.
everybody.
Jerry, it was an honor being on the panel with you all.